So today, we're getting a talk from Dr. Temitope Oriola on policing after George Floyd's murder. Um, Looking at whether police are reformable. So Dr. Oriola is Joint Editor-in-Chief of African Security and an Associate Professor here in the Department of Sociology. He's a recipient of the Governor General of Canada Academic Gold Medal and the author of Criminal Resistance, the Politics of Kidnapping Oil Workers from Rutledge. So without, Dr. Oriola's research expertise encompasses policing, weaponization and use of force by police, terrorism studies, resource wars or insurgencies, and political kidnapping. And he's a two-time Carnegie Fellow and president of the Canadian Association of African Studies. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Oriola. And if you could all mute your microphones, I can go through and do that as well, just so that we see him and nothing else. All right, Dr. Oriola, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to see so many faces. And I'd like to begin by thanking the director of the CCR, my colleague Sandra Basilios, for inviting me. Thank you, Jeffrey Bassad, for all of the logistical work. And I appreciate our colleagues in the media who have also taken time off their busy schedules to join us today. And of course, my amazing colleagues in the Department of Sociology. Thank you all for being here today. Some caveats are crucial at this early stage. First, while several of the issues confronting the police in the US have their equivalents in Canada, the texture and gravity are arguably different. My point is that Minneapolis or Atlanta police is not Edmonton police. Therefore, I fully intend to maintain perspective on that distinction given the permeation of the Canadian traditional and social media landscape with events and episodes in the US. Second, my encounters with the EPS, precisely one encounter, and perhaps counting one of my favorite neighbors who often helped out mowing my lawn in several of my long research trips every year since 2013. Those have been incredibly positive encounters. And I hasten to add that his teenage son has taken over the duties in the last year and a half. So those have been my encounters with police in Canada. Absolutely positive, and therefore, I have zero negative experience with the EPS or any police organization in Canada. And the implication of that, of course, is that my arguments, both as a scholar and as a Black male, are unencumbered by any personal negative experience or grievance. But of course, I am aware and reflexive of the fact that I am one of less than 1% of the Canadian population with a PhD, and one of less than 20 Black tenured or tenure-track professors at the U of A, out of a total of 2,059 persons. That positionality comes with certain privileges. I'm aware that there are, of course, the interactional minutiae and intersubjective micro-sociological dimensions. As one US border agent told me a couple of years back as I breezed through the fast lane as a Nexus Global Travel member, and I'm quoting him now, "Let me guess, you are either a medical doctor or a professor." I smiled and told him that one of his suggestions was accurate, but that he would likely not survive it if I operated on any part of his body. Now, my left hand, for those who know me, is more active than my right, although I am in fact right-handed. Now, to my talk, policing after George Floyd, and our police organizations reformable. George Floyd was killed in a police encounter on the streets of Minneapolis on 25th May. Floyd's digitized and widely disseminated asphyxiation through that knee on the neck has led to global protests against police violence and other forms of oppressions around the world. From the UK to Canada, Belgium to Australia, and so forth, social movements have taken off with the explicit aim of demanding the removal or outrightly carrying out the destruction of historical monuments and other symbols of colonialism and slavery. Calls for defunding the police have also grown. So has solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot has changed, and much remains unchanged since George Floyd's death. For instance, on May 27th this year, Toronto, a Black woman, Regis Koczynski-Packett, died from a fall shortly after police responded to her family's call for assistance to deal with her mental crisis. Video evidence from the incident were not made public, but selective leaks appeared in the Toronto Sun. The Ontario Police Oversight Organization, the Special Investigations Unit, SIU, noted, and I'm quoting now, leaks of this nature detract from the public's confidence and the family's confidence in the integrity of the SIU investigation, unquote. The integrity and victimhood of the dead woman were seemingly questioned in the leaks. On June 6th, Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation released a video regarding his maltreatment by the Wood Buffalo RCMP in Fort McMurray. The chief noted, and I'm quoting now, "I could feel that I was going unconscious, and all I can remember is the blood gushing out of my mouth," unquote. The picture of his bloodied face was widely disseminated on social media. The reason for the encounter with the police was an expired license plate. The RCMP charged the chief with resisting arrest and unlawful assault of a police officer. And many of you may recall that an RCMP officer knocked down an Inuk man with a car door earlier in the same week. Two federal ministers expressed their outrage over the chief's abuse, and the prime minister said he was deeply alarmed by the incident. The charges against the chief were dropped about 2 weeks later. On August 27th, the CBC reported that the Edmonton Police Service will in a fortnight take delivery of a $500,000 armored tank that was paid for 2 years earlier. Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson described the new acquisition as, quote, remarkably tone deaf. He goes on to argue, and I'm quoting him now, "I'm not convinced that this is a reasonable expenditure since they already have two, meaning two armored tanks." The CBC's Janice Johnston, who broke the news, noted, and I'm quoting now, "The purchase was never spelled out in the city's capital budgets," unquote. It was in fact listed under the generic term new vehicles. Technically, an armored tank is a vehicle in the same way that a Prius and an aircraft are vehicles. I must add that the armored tank was ordered before the current police chief, Dale McPhee, was hired. Another example of what has happened since George Floyd's murder, on 24 September, Chief McPhee announced the formation of a community council comprising persons from marginalized communities. As I informed Andrew Jeffrey, a CBC journalist, during my interview with him on Monday this week, the community council is a step in the right direction. I appreciate the chief's approach. It is very different from previous approaches. It is very empathetic and quite approachable. But it doesn't address the most immediate and pragmatic steps that can and ought to be taken on the order of the EPS chief. It is unclear how the new initiative differs from several others that date back to at least 2004, under the same name, by the way. A series of conversation cafes, which the chief said would last through 2021, shouldn't be seen as a solution in and of itself, and is not needed to end police practices such as carding, which research shows disproportionately target racialized groups. That's something within the authority of the chief. Now, the chief also noted that changes suggested by the community council would be implemented, quote, as soon as possible. This is a time-tested, world historical, bureaucratic language for inaction. In other words, the more things change, the more they remain the same. This is both peculiar and non-peculiar to police organizations. There are four broad processual theoretical schemata deployed in the management literature to interrogate change and development in organizations. These are life cycle, teleology, dialectics, and evolutionary theories. And here I'm drawing on the work of Van der Ven and Poole, published in 1995. Van der Ven and Poole argue that the life cycle perspective presupposes an immanent logic, an inherent code and prefiguration evident in an organization's current form, which influence change. Therefore, from this perspective, despite external stimuli, such as social agitations for change, the immanent logic of the organization prevails. External stimuli only shapes how the organization expresses itself. This is an organismic approach to change. The development of the human fetus, for instance, is often cited in the literature as an example. The teleological theoretical orientation is derived from the concept teleology, which all sociologists here would be familiar with, which itself is a coinage from the Greek terms telos, which means and logos, which means reason. The teleological orientation focuses on the idea that purpose or goal is the main drive of organizational change. Sociologists would recognize this approach from elementary structural functionalism, so Robert Merton and so on, and the social constructionism of Peter Bergert, Thomas Lockman, and so forth. The organizational teleological orientation presupposes that every entity has a purpose, possesses the capacity to adapt to both intrinsic and extrinsic factors as it proceeds towards a goal. For Van der Ven and Poole, development is, quote, a repetitive cycle or sequence of goal formulation, implementation, evaluation, and modification, unquote. This approach differs from the life cycle orientation as it does not stipulate any prefiguration or fundamental inimitable direction or process. The dialectical approach to organizational change speaks to the existence of diametrically or asymmetric ideations, values, forces, and missions within and outside an organization. This approach recognizes that an organization exists within an intrinsically complex world, and there may be centripetal and centrifugal forces within and outside that organization pushing the soul and fabric of the organization in different directions. This is connected to issues of control and domination. Within this empirical and ideational universe, change is a function of challenges to the status quo. The demands for reimagining, re-envisioning, or defunding the police may be viewed from this perspective. The organization that emerges from the battle between these two forces, for instance, those who see little that is wrong with the current structure and modus operandi, and those who are clamoring for change, may in fact be nothing like what each side wants. The reformed organization, to the extent that reforms do happen, may in turn become the status quo and epicenter of social grievances in the near future. The evolutionary orientation requires little introduction. I will not overflow that. Now, reforms and change in police organizations have long been a major scholarly concern. Writing in 1974, Sandler and Maines argue, I'm quoting now, police organizations, because of their paramilitary organization styles, have tended to resist change more than other organizations, unquote. Lingamneni, writing in 1979, argues, and I'm quoting now, innovation and professionalism have been used and abused by police management as an unchallenged and simplistic explanation to subordinates in rulemaking and implementation. These concepts are also presented as respectable images before the public, while the police departments, for the most part, still function in an archaic and outmoded fashion. The officers generally resist change and innovation in the existing police structure and routine. Systems of reward and punishment, as well as career development and promotional opportunity, often tend to support this semi-skilled laborer concept rather than law enforcement as a profession, unquote. This is a very strong statement. Among other things, this speaks to the need to raise the minimum qualifications for entry to policing in Canada and favor recruits with a university degree. Within the Canadian context, to my knowledge, this was first noted by Frank Iacobucci, a former justice of the Supreme Court, in his 2014 report on the response of the Toronto Police Service to individuals in mental distress. I have championed that argument since the death of George Floyd because of the evidentiary consensus in the literature that officers without a university degree populate the ranks of killer cops. My June article on the matter, published by The Conversation, went viral and was republished by over 20 media organizations within and outside Canada. I have since then been fascinated by public and media interest in several findings of my collaborative research team, which was established back in 2008 with our first publication released back in 2010. Sandler and Mays, and as well as Lingam Nenny, whom I cited earlier, wrote in the 1970s and primarily about the US. But what does the Canadian context look like? A Canadian study by Rogers, McIntyre, and Caputo, published this year, explores the strategic plans of 23 Canadian police departments. They find that the strategic plans, I'm quoting now, vary considerably with respect to environmental scans, statements of values, vision and missions, descriptions of goals, and resources to be applied to goal achievement, unquote. Now, that's not unexpected. Each police department responds within its context based on its own peculiar realities. However, it is intriguing that Caputo and colleagues found that the organizations could also vary in indicators to be used to assess success and inform action, and pay limited attention to statements of strategic purpose, unquote. Despite years of the much trumpeted community policing, most police departments have largely remained unchanged in their mode of operation. One study concludes that, I'm citing them now, in many police agencies, community-oriented policing seems to represent a method of strategic buffering of a largely unaltered core police operation, unquote. This perspective, by the way, is widespread in the scholarly literature. Now, my central thesis in this talk is uncomplicated. Police departments, like other organizations, are self-interested, survival-oriented, self-perpetuating entities. Now, that is not a critique. It is, in fact, a source of optimism. Police organizations are not different from NGOs in that regard, in terms of tendency towards self-perpetuation and survival. But under what conditions do police organizations change to facilitate reforms? The policing and sociology of organizations literature contains some important insights. Several studies demonstrate reforms in police organizations depend on organizational culture, leadership styles, ideology, perceived attributes of the innovation, type of innovation, timeliness, communication channels, and community social system, among several other variables. However, as Monique Marks in her paper in the British Journal of Criminology cautions concerning the pace of change in South Africa, I'm quoting her now, new policies and legislation do not automatically bring about desired transformation within the police. Effective police transformation may require a more radical challenge of established police culture. Such a challenge, it is argued, may be generated by dissident police groupings which defy existing police practice and frameworks, unquote. Now, I'm quite wary of the term radical as it alienates people and shuts down potential for collaboration. I believe there is a middle ground. Now, to return to the question in the title of this talk, are police organizations reformable? The answer is an antinomy. The answer is no and yes. No, because it is not entirely in the hands of the police. Those that Matthew Matuzia calls institutional sovereigns outside policing are the entities that are most significant in whether police organizations are reformable. Reforming the police is not a mere operational question. It is not about strategic plans or policy. It also goes beyond changing existing legislation, though all of those are important. Reforming the police is an implicitly and explicitly political question, fundamentally embedded in the political process and the major actors therein, as well as the signals they send. Now, the first step to reform is to acknowledge that you have a problem. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lockett informed the Global Mail on June 10th, so just over 2 weeks after George Floyd died, that, I'm quoting her now, "I have to admit, I really struggle with the term systemic racism. I have heard about 5 or 10 different definitions on TV. I think that if systemic racism is meaning that racism is entrenched in our policies and procedures, I would say that we don't have systemic racism," unquote. When asked about Commissioner Lockett's statement a day later, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau informed the media that, I'm quoting the Prime Minister now, "Systemic racism is an issue right across the country, in all our institutions, including in all our police forces, including in the RCMP. That is what systemic racism is," unquote. Of course, that was a direct response to Commissioner Lockett. Now, barely 24 hours after the Prime Minister's comment and 2 days after her initial remarks, Commissioner Lockett changed her perspective and clarified, among other things, that, I'm citing her now, "I did not say definitively that systemic racism exists in the RCMP. I should have," unquote. Perhaps the commissioner came across some fine, incontrovertible, nomothetic socioscientific data hours after the Prime Minister's comments. The Alberta RCMP Deputy Commissioner, Curtis Zablocki, also walked away from his earlier stance. And as someone who studied policing for some time, I found the episode quite fascinating. I wish to reiterate that police reform is a political matter. It does not take place in a political vacuum. The impetus to reform really comes from within police organizations. The Prime Minister communicated a strong and unambiguous political position. The RCMP Commissioner was arguably aware that she could not maintain her position while at odds with the standpoint of the federal government, and the Prime Minister no less. The Prime Minister busted the institutional happy talk of the RCMP. The apologies to Sarah Ahmed. Now, what is the lesson from that? Police departments will do that which coheres with their reading and appreciation of what the powers that be want. Now, Other institutional sovereigns with significant impact on the texture and quality of policing include all elected leaders, particularly mayors, premiers, and justice ministers at all levels. The media, academia, think tanks, and labor unions are also important institutional sovereigns. Rather than protest in front of police stations or against police officers, I argue that protests should be directed at elected politicians who have the power to make changes. The public must hold elected politicians responsible whenever there is any unnecessary use of force or death of a civilian in the hands of the police. The public is also a critical stakeholder whose conscience collective determines the type of policing that occurs in society. We have a policing problem because we have a serious societal problem regarding difference. Police officers are recruited from society. Police officers are us. As Jock Young points out, I'm quoting Jock Young now, the imputation of criminality to the deviant order is a necessary part of exclusion, unquote. In Canada, primarily Indigenous and Black people. In the US, African Americans and Latinos. In Australia, Indigenous people. In New Zealand, Maori people. In Germany, Turkish people. In Turkey, Kurdish people. You get the point. The public, as once again, has a huge role to play. A grand jury in New York failed to indict the officer who put Eric Garner in a chokehold, despite video evidence and explicit ban on the use of the chokehold by the NYPD prior to the incident. James Forcillo, the police officer who killed Toronto teenager Sami Yatim in July 2013, received a 6-year sentence and was paroled after serving 2 years. These legal outcomes contribute to impunity. Such outcomes condone misconduct and create a toxic atmosphere for many, many hardworking police officers who treat the public with dignity and respect on a daily basis. I've also studied armed insurgency in Africa and noticed growing contextual and situational similarities with the US in relation to the use of force against civilians. In June this year, I began to write an op-ed to warn the public, specifically the US public, on the possibility of an urban-based guerrilla-style, leaderless, structurally non-hierarchical armed insurgency in the States. I chose not to complete the op-ed. Public communication is the enemy of nuance. The critical factors for development of an armed insurgency, from my findings and understanding of that context in the developing world, include transgenerational oppression, a mature sense of injustice, consciousness raising or watershed moments, events and episodes. That is, the realization that the conditions are unnatural and blatantly unfair. And so, of course, let's think of the assassination of George Floyd. Scarce but socially valuable resources, so socioeconomic status and income levels and so on and so forth. Other variables conducive for an armed insurgency include an army of people, particularly males, who have nothing to lose. The US has an abundant supply of people, especially those with criminal records, who are surplus to the requirements of a conventional system. Another variable is an immediate hyper-visible insignia or masthead of state power. This is usually the military in developing countries, but the police are the main actors within the US, with the US military, of course, necessarily externally oriented. Such an insurgency develops when there is a specific identifiable constituency to purport to fight for, and a modicum of support within the identified constituency. Other variables include abundant supply of small arms and light weapons. The US, as we all know, has an abundance of such weapons. It's #1 in the world in that regard. The country that is in the second place in terms of civilian firearms in the world is Yemen, Yemen, by the way, has approximately half of the US supply of civilian firearms. Now, insurgencies in the developing world also tend to occur when there is a relatively powerful section of the broader public considered antagonistic. In the United States, those I imagine as skinheads and neo-Nazis who have become more visible since the Obama presidency and more vocal since the Trump presidency. Finally, a grand jury in the case of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky indicted one of 3 officers on first-degree wanton endangerment charges after 6 months. The charges relate to the danger posed by reckless shots fired into an adjacent apartment where a pregnant woman, a child, and a man were present. In other words, legally speaking, no one killed Breonna Taylor. Perhaps she killed herself in her sleep by firing on herself 5 times through the guns of the police. But don't take my legal opinion. I am yet to complete my law degree at the University of London. And of course, like every 10-year sociology professor, I don't know if I'll make a good lawyer. Ronaldo, my former pet, a golden doodle, never won a case in which I was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. Thank you for listening.